The American Revolutionary War, also known as the American War of Independence, was a conflict that took place between 1775 and 1783, resulting in the 13 American colonies breaking away from British rule and forming the United States of America. The war began due to growing tensions between the colonies and the British government over issues such as taxation without representation, trade restrictions, and British military presence in the colonies. Events like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Boston Massacre in 1770, and the Boston Tea Party in 1773 fueled resentment. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 to seek a peaceful resolution, but after British troops clashed with colonial militias at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, armed conflict became unavoidable. The war was rooted in the colony's desire for self-governance and economic freedom, while Britain aimed to maintain control over its empire. As the conflict escalated, the Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. The Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson and adopted on July 4, 1776, formally announced the colony's break from Britain and articulated the belief in natural rights and popular sovereignty. The Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775 proved the determination of the colonial forces. In 1777, the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga was a turning point, convincing France to enter the war as an American ally. The harsh winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778 tested the resilience of Washington's troops, but also saw crucial training that strengthened the army. The war's final major engagement occurred at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where American and French forces surrounded British General Cornwallis, forcing his surrender. George Washington proved steady leadership, while figures like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson were instrumental in both governance and diplomacy. This conflict resulted in the deaths of around 25,000 to 70,000 American patriots. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, in which Britain recognized American independence. The Revolutionary War not only established a new nation, but also inspired democratic movements worldwide. The War of 1812 was a military conflict between the United States and Great Britain that lasted from 1812 to 1815. The war began due to several unresolved tensions from the American Revolutionary War, as well as new issues. The main problems were that the British were putting restrictions on American trade during the Napoleonic Wars. The British forced American sailors into the Royal Navy, and the British gave support to Native American resistance against American expansion in the Northwest Territory. Many Americans, specifically the Warhawks in Congress, saw the war as an opportunity to defend national honor, secure maritime rights, and possibly expand U.S. territory into British Canada. The conflict began in June 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain. At the time, Britain was deeply involved in fighting Napoleon in Europe and gave limited attention to the war in North America. Much of the early fighting occurred along the US-Canadian border, where the Americans launched several unsuccessful invasions. American naval forces won significant victories on the Great Lakes, such as Oliver Hazard Perry's triumph at the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. Another key victory came in 1813, when American forces, under William Henry Harrison, defeated a British native alliance at the Battle of the Thames. The British launched a powerful counteroffensive in 1814. After Napoleon's defeat in Europe, they invaded the Chesapeake region, capturing Washington, D.C., and burning the White House and Capitol. However, the Americans defended Baltimore in the Battle of Fort McHenry, an event that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. In the South, General Andrew Jackson became a national hero after his decisive victory over the British at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, though the battle occurred after a peace treaty had already been signed. Despite being militarily inconclusive, the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, effectively ended the war by restoring pre-war boundaries without addressing all American grievances. While no clear victor emerged, the war fostered a strong sense of national identity in the United States. It confirmed American independence, weakened Native American resistance in the Northwest, and helped propel figures like Andrew Jackson into national prominence. The War of 1812 is often remembered as the Second War for Independence. The Mexican-American War was a conflict between the United States and Mexico that lasted from 1846 to 1848. It was primarily caused by the U.S. annexation of Texas in 1845, which Mexico still considered part of its territory despite the Texas Revolution nearly a decade earlier. Tensions escalated when President James K. Polk, an advocate of Manifest Destiny, the idea that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, sent troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed border region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. In April 1846, a battle occurred between American and Mexican forces in the disputed zone, prompting the U.S. Congress to declare war. The war was driven by both political and territorial ambitions. The United States aimed to acquire California and other Mexican territories in the West. After early clashes in northern Mexico, American forces launched a series of successful campaigns. General Zachary Taylor led victories at the battles of Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and especially the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, where a smaller American force repelled a much larger Mexican army. Meanwhile, General Winfield Scott led a bold maritime assault at Veracruz, then marched inland and captured Mexico City after several key victories. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Under the treaty, Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas and ceded a vast amount of territory to the United States, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed certain debts. The war significantly expanded U.S. territory, but also intensified sectional tensions over the expansion of slavery. The Mexican American War thus played a key role in shaping the geography and politics of the United States in the years leading up to the Civil War. The American Civil War was a devastating conflict that took place from 1861 to 1865, fought between the United States, also known as the Union, and 11 southern states that seceded to form the Confederate States of America. The primary cause of the war was the long-standing debate over slavery, specifically its expansion into newly acquired Western territories. Tensions between the North and South had grown over issues such as states' rights, economic differences, and the future of slavery. The immediate spark came after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed the spread of slavery. In response, southern states began to secede, starting with South Carolina, and war officially began in April 1861 when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War was defined by large-scale battles, massive casualties, and significant destruction. It featured both conventional warfare, with armies meeting in open fields, and elements of trench warfare, raids, and blockades. Key battles included the First Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the Siege of Vicksburg. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 resulted in a turning point in the war, halting Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. That same year, the Union gained full control of the Mississippi River, with the capture of Vicksburg, effectively splitting the Confederacy. Important Union leaders included President Abraham Lincoln, who guided the nation through its greatest crisis and issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. Militarily, General Ulysses S. Grant rose to prominence with victories in the Western Theater, and eventually became a commander of all Union armies. The Civil War ended in April 1655 when General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Union's victory preserved the United States as a single nation and led to the abolition of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment. The war resulted in over 600,000 deaths, making it the deadliest conflict in American history. It left deep scars on the country, but also paved the way for Reconstruction and the long, ongoing struggle for civil rights. The Indian Wars were a series of conflicts between the United States and various Native American tribes that took place over several centuries, but most significantly from the late 1700s through the late 1800s. These wars were rooted in the expansion of U.S. settlers into native lands, fueled by the belief in manifest destiny. As settlers pushed westward, they intruded on tribal territories, often breaking treaties, seizing land, and provoking resistance from native nations. The U.S. government frequently responded with military force to suppress native resistance and secure land for settlement, mining, and railroads. Early battles included conflicts in the Ohio Valley, such as the Northwest Indian War from 1785 to 1795. The wars intensified after the Civil War, specifically in the plains in the West. Important battles included the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where U.S. troops killed over 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho people in Colorado, and the Fetterman Fight of 1866, where Lakota warriors ambushed and killed 81 U.S. soldiers in Wyoming. Important American figures in the Indian Wars included General William Tecumseh Sherman, who implemented harsh policies aimed at forcing native surrender, and General Philip Sheridan, who oversaw many campaigns in the plains. These leaders often destroyed villages and food supplies to weaken native resistance. The warfare ranged from conventional battles to ambushes and raids, with the U.S. Army frequently employing superior firepower and infrastructure to fight off native forces. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people died during the Indian Wars, including soldiers, settlers, and Native Americans. The outcome was the near total loss of native sovereignty, as most tribes were forcibly removed to reservations. The wars ended with the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, where U.S. troops killed over 300 Lakota, including women and children, effectively crushing the last large-scale native resistance. The Indian Wars had a profound impact on American history, leading to the widespread displacement and cultural destruction of indigenous peoples across the United States. The Spanish-American War was a short but significant conflict between the United States and Spain that took place in 1898. The war began primarily over American support for the Cuban struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule, as well as broader U.S. interest in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Tensions escalated after the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898, which killed over 260 American sailors. Although the cause of the explosion was unclear, American newspapers, influenced by sensationalist yellow journalism, blamed Spain and stirred public demand for war. In April 1898, Congress declared war on Spain, citing the protection of American interests and the need to liberate oppressed peoples. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy under Commodore George Dewey quickly destroyed the Spanish fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines. In the Caribbean, key battles included the naval battle of Santiago de Cuba and the land battles of San Juan Hill and El Caney in Cuba. The charge up San Juan Hill by Theodore Roosevelt and his volunteer regiment, the Rough Riders, became one of the most famous moments of the war, though much of the actual fighting was done by black regiments known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Theodore Roosevelt, although only a colonel, gained national fame and later became president due in part to his role in the conflict. The U.S. military used a combination of naval superiority, rapid assaults, and traditional infantry tactics. The war lasted only about 4 months and resulted in fewer than 400 American combat deaths, though over 2,000 U.S. troops died from disease and illness. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. Spain ceded control of Cuba, which became independent, and transferred Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The outcome resulted in the emergence of the United States as a global power with overseas territories. However, the annexation of the Philippines sparked debate and led to the Philippine American War soon after. The Spanish-American War signaled a turning point in U.S. foreign policy, shifting from continental expansion to imperialism. The Philippine American War was a conflict fought from 1899 to 1902 between the United States and Filipino revolutionaries who sought independence following the U.S. acquisition of the Philippines from Spain. The war began shortly after the end of the Spanish-American War, where Filipino leaders, specifically Emilio Aguinaldo, believed the U.S. would grant the Philippines independence after Spain's defeat. However, the United States intended to establish control over the islands, sparking resentment and ultimately armed conflict. The war officially began on February 4, 1899, where a skirmish between American and Filipino troops erupted near Manila. What began as a conventional conflict quickly turned into a brutal guerrilla war, as Filipino forces, outmatched by American firepower, shifted tactics. Early battles included the Battle of Manila and the Battle of Iloilo. As the war progressed, Filipino fighters launched ambushes, sabotage, and raids in rural areas, while American forces responded with aggressive counterinsurgency tactics, including using concentration camps and executions. The fighting was intensified and often brutal, especially in regions such as Luzon and Samar. Important American figures included President William McKinley, who initially supported the annexation of the Philippines, and his successor, Theodore Roosevelt, who continued the war effort. The war caused immense human suffering. Around 4,300 American soldiers died, mostly from disease, while Filipino casualties were far higher, with estimates ranging from over 200 to 300,000, including many civilians who died from combat, famine, and disease. The war officially ended in July 1902 when the U.S. declared victory, though sporadic resistance continued for years afterward. The Philippines remained under American control until after World War II. The Philippine American War had many long-term consequences, including distrust and resentment among Filipinos. It also resulted in the beginning of the United States' role as a colonial power in the Pacific, raising major questions at home about imperialism and democracy. World War I, also known as the Great War, was a global conflict that lasted from 1914 to 1918. Though the United States did not enter the war until 1917, the war began in Europe following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, leading to a chain reaction of alliances and declarations of war. The central conflict involved the Allied powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, against the Central Powers led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. While the United States initially maintained neutrality, several factors drew the nation into the conflict, including Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which targeted American ships, and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany encouraged Mexico to wage war against the US. The United States entered the war on April 6, 1917, declaring war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson justified the decision as necessary to make the world quote-unquote safe for democracy. The American Expeditionary Forces, led by General John J. Pershing, arrived in Europe in large numbers by 1918 and played a crucial role in strengthening Allied forces on the Western Front. The primary type of warfare used in World War I was trench warfare, which involved long, fortified lines of soldiers living in harsh conditions and launching attacks across no man's land. The war also saw the use of machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes, leading to massive casualties and stalemates. The conditions were brutal and disease was rampant. The United States mobilized over 4 million military personnel, with over 116,000 Americans dying during the war, including from combat and disease. The war ended on November 11, 1918, with the signing of an armistice. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war but imposed harsh penalties on Germany. The outcome of World War I reshaped global politics and resulted in the emergence of the United States as a major world power. Domestically, the war led to significant social and economic changes, including the advancement of women in the workforce and the beginning of the Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities. The war also set the stage for future international tensions and the eventual outbreak of World War II. World War II was a global conflict that took place from 1939 to 1945, with the United States entering the war in 1941 after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan. The war was rooted in unresolved tensions from World War I, the rise of fascist regimes in Germany and Italy, and imperial ambitions in Europe and Asia. The conflict quickly escalated into a struggle between the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied powers, including the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and others. The United States formally entered the war on December 8, 1941, the day after Japan bombed the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Prior to this, the US had remained officially neutral while providing material support to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease. Once involved, the US fought in two major theaters, the European theater against Germany and Italy, and the Pacific theater against Japan. The war was fought using a variety of warfare types, including trench warfare, maritime assaults, aerial bombings, and eventually atomic warfare. In Europe, the D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, resulted in a turning point as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, leading to the liberation of Western Europe. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in 1942 and the island-hopping campaigns, including the battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were crucial in pushing back Japanese forces. The war in the Pacific ended after the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Prominent American figures included General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, General Douglas MacArthur, who led forces in the Pacific, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who guided the nation through most of the war until his death in April 1945. He was succeeded by Harry S. Truman, who authorized the use of atomic bombs. World War II resulted in an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths worldwide, with over 400,000 American military deaths. The war ended with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945 and Japan in September 1945. The conflict drastically altered the global power structure, ushered in the Cold War, and solidified the United States as a leading world superpower. It also led to the creation of the United Nations in an effort to prevent future global conflicts. The Korean War was a conflict that occurred from June 25, 1950 to July 27, 1953 between North Korea and South Korea, with the United States and other United Nations members supporting South Korea. The war began when North Korean Communist forces, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the peninsula under a single communist government. The United States, under President Harry S. Truman, quickly intervened as part of a United Nations coalition, viewing the invasion as a direct threat to the containment of communism during the early Cold War period. The war involved intense and often brutal fighting, featuring both conventional and guerrilla warfare. Early in the conflict, American and South Korean forces were pushed into a smaller defensive perimeter around the city of Busan. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur led a daring assault at Incheon, which turned the tide of the war and allowed UN forces to recapture Seoul and push North Korean troops back across the 38th parallel. However, as UN forces advanced toward the Yalu River near the Chinese border, China entered the war with massive troop support for North Korea, leading to a long and bloody stalemate. American forces relied on infantry assaults, heavy artillery, and air power, including strategic bombings of North Korean infrastructure. Harsh weather conditions, especially during the Chosin campaign in the winter of 1950, made fighting even more difficult. Over 36,000 American service members died in the Korean War, and over 100,000 were wounded. In total, the war caused millions of military and civilian casualties on both sides. The Korean War ended in a military armistice on July 27, 1953, but no formal peace treaty was signed, meaning the war technically never ended. The 38th parallel remains the dividing line between North and South Korea, with a heavily fortified demilitarized zone. The conflict solidified the Cold War divide and confirmed the United States' commitment to containing communism worldwide. The Vietnam War was a prolonged conflict that took place from the late 1950s to 1975, with major US military involvement beginning in 1965 and ending in 1973. The war stemmed from the broader Cold War struggle between communism and democracy. After the French colonial rule in Vietnam ended in 1954, the country was divided into Communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and non-communist South Vietnam, supported by the United States. The US aimed to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, following the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, others would follow. The conflict escalated as communist insurgents, known as the Viet Cong, supported by North Vietnam, launched attacks against the South Vietnamese government. The United States initially sent military advisors, but eventually deployed large combat forces, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which led Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad war powers. Major U.S. combat operatives began in 1965 and continued through the Nixon administration, which gradually reduced troop numbers while attempting to strengthen South Vietnamese forces under the policy of Vietnamization. The war featured intense guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and jungle combat, as well as large-scale conventional battles and heavy aerial bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong's use of booby traps and underground tunnel networks made combat exceptionally difficult for American troops. Key battles involving US forces included the Tet Offensive in 1968, which, despite being a military failure for the North, significantly weakened American public support for the war. Over 58,000 American service members died in the Vietnam War, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers also lost their lives. The war officially ended for the United States in 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, and all American troops were withdrawn. However, in 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, leading to the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War left a major impact on American society, politics, and military policy, and it remains one of the most controversial conflicts in U.S. history. The War on Terror is a broad and ongoing international military campaign launched by the United States in response to the terror attacks on September 11, 2001. That day, the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. In the wake of the attacks, President George W. Bush declared a global war on terror aimed at defeating acts of terror and preventing future attacks on U.S. soil. The first major conflict under this campaign was the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, targeting the Taliban regime for harboring al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. This war aimed to dismantle terror training camps and remove the Taliban from power. Although the initial invasion quickly toppled the Taliban, the conflict turned into a prolonged counterinsurgency and nation-building effort lasting nearly 2 decades. The United States also invaded Iraq under the belief that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to terror groups. Such weapons were never found, and the war transitioned into a long insurgency in efforts to stabilize the country. The War on Terror involved many types of warfare, including conventional military operations, counterinsurgency, drone strikes, and special operations missions. Urban combat, improvised explosive devices, and guerrilla tactics were commonly used by enemy insurgents. One of the most notable missions was the US Navy SEAL raid in 2011 that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Other than President George W. Bush, President Barack Obama oversaw the bin Laden raid and troop withdrawals, and President Donald Trump further reduced US involvement in the Middle East. The human cost of the War on Terror has been significant. Over 7,000 American service members died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with hundreds of thousands of civilians killed across the broader conflict zones. The US officially ended its military mission in Afghanistan in August 2021, withdrawing all troops as the Taliban regained control. The War on Terror reshaped US foreign policy, led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, and raised ongoing debates about national security, surveillance, and civil liberties. It remains one of the most complex and consequential military efforts in modern American history. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the wars I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see more like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.